Some stories don't begin with love. They begin with silence. The kind of silence that fills apartments late at night. The kind that settles into the chest when the city outside keeps moving, and you don't. In the United States, cities glow after midnight. Office lights, traffic signals, apartment windows. Millions of people awake, pretending they are not waiting for something. Mary Collins was one of them. Night after night she stood by her window, watching reflections of herself disappear into the glass. She didn't feel dramatic. She didn't feel dangerous. She felt invisible. And invisibility, when it lasts too long, changes people. Years later, when everything was already broken, someone would ask how it all started. They would expect a betrayal, a confession, a scandal. But the truth is simpler. It started when wanting became unbearable. Mary Collins had always believed her life would be quiet. Not tragic, not extraordinary. Just quiet in the way some lives never demand attention. She grew up learning how to stay out of the way, how to listen more than speak, how to observe rooms before stepping into them. She was never the loudest child, never the most emotional, never the one teachers worried about. And because of that, she was often forgotten. Her childhood passed without catastrophe, but also without warmth. There were no dramatic memories to point to, no single moment she could blame. What remained instead was something far more subtle, the feeling of always being slightly disconnected, even from people who cared about her. As an adult, Mary perfected the art of appearing fine. She built a life that looked stable from the outside. A small apartment in a quiet American city. A steady job. Predictable routines that gave her days structure and her nights silence. People described her as responsible, dependable, easy to work with. No one described her as lonely. Mary woke up early every morning. She followed the same rituals. Coffee, shower, neutral clothing chosen for practicality rather than expression. At work, she focused intensely. She listened carefully. She delivered results without drawing attention to herself. And when the workday ended, she returned home to an apartment that felt more like a waiting room than a place meant to be lived in. She spent evenings sitting on the couch with the television on, not really watching. Sometimes she scrolled through her phone. Sometimes she stared at nothing at all. The silence didn't scare her anymore. It had been with her too long for that. Mary told herself this was adulthood, that love was optional, that companionship was something people talked about more than they actually needed, that independence meant learning how to live without being chosen. She watched friends drift into relationships, marriages, families. She attended weddings and smiled sincerely, even as something inside her quietly folded in on itself. She never felt jealous in the dramatic sense. What she felt was smaller, a dull awareness that something essential had simply passed her by. And the longer that feeling stayed unchallenged, the more permanent it seemed. Mary did not think of herself as someone capable of obsession. She believed obsession belonged to louder people, to unstable people, to people who lacked control. She prided herself on control. That belief protected her, until it didn't. Because the danger wasn't that Mary wanted too much. The danger was that she had learned how to live wanting almost nothing at all. And when someone finally disrupted that silence, it hit harder than she was prepared for. John Harris did not enter Mary's life like a storm. He arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, the way permanent things often do. There was no dramatic introduction, no moment that demanded attention. Just an email announcing a change in management, followed by a calm voice at the head of a conference table. From the first day, John carried himself differently from the others. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the posture of a man who had learned early how to occupy space without abusing it. His movements were measured, his gestures economical. He never rushed through conversations, and he never filled silence unnecessarily. People listened to him not because they were afraid of him, but because he made listening feel worthwhile. John was in his early 40s, visibly mature, the kind of man whose age showed not in wrinkles but in restraint. He wore neutral suits, spoke in a steady tone, maintained eye contact without turning it into a challenge. To Mary, this mattered more than she realized. In a workplace filled with noise, forced enthusiasm, corporate optimism, endless small talk, John's calm felt like relief. He did not demand emotional energy. He did not overwhelm. He simply existed, solid and controlled. Everyone knew he was married. Evelyn Harris was mentioned occasionally, usually in passing. John never complained about his marriage, never praised it either. When asked, he answered politely, vaguely, as if the subject belonged to another version of his life. There were no children, no stories about family chaos, no photos on his desk, just a quiet personal life that seemed sealed off. Mary noticed everything. She noticed how John listened when she spoke, not interrupting, not correcting, not performing authority. She noticed that he remembered details from previous conversations, small things, things most people forgot. She told herself this was professionalism. But professionalism didn't explain the way her shoulders relaxed when he entered the room, or the subtle disappointment she felt when meetings ended without him saying her name. John treated Mary with respect, nothing more, nothing less, and that balance confused her. He didn't flirt. He didn't cross lines. But he didn't ignore her either. In Mary's world, attention had always been extreme or absent. Too much or none at all. John offered something unfamiliar, steady presence. Without realizing it, she began associating him with safety. When work felt overwhelming, his voice grounded her. When doubt crept in, his approval steadied her. When silence followed her home, thoughts of him filled the space. She didn't want John. Not yet. She wanted what being around him made her feel: calm, anchored, seen without being exposed. And slowly, quietly, that feeling began to attach itself to him alone. Mary watched how John interacted with others. He was polite but distant, friendly but controlled. There were boundaries in everything he did. That should have reassured her. Instead, it made him feel unattainable. And unattainable things have a way of growing larger in the mind than they deserve. John never gave Mary false hope, but he gave her consistency. And for someone who had lived so long inside emotional uncertainty, consistency felt dangerously close to intimacy. She began to imagine conversations that never happened, interpret silences that meant nothing, wait for moments that were never promised, all while John remained exactly the same. Stable, married, unavailable. Mary didn't yet realize what was happening, but something inside her had already shifted. And once that shift occurred, silence was no longer neutral. It was painful. Mary did not realize when admiration stopped being harmless. There was no clear line, no sudden moment of awareness. It happened gradually, hidden inside routine disguised as professionalism. At first, John was simply part of her workday, a presence in meetings, a voice on conference calls, a figure moving through hallways with the same calm rhythm every day. But repetition has power. The more predictable John became, the more Mary's mind began to organize itself around him. She noticed how her body reacted before her thoughts did. Her shoulders relaxed when he entered the room. Her breathing slowed when he spoke. The tension she carried all day softened in his presence. That scared her. Because Mary had spent most of her life managing herself, controlling emotions, containing expectations, avoiding disappointment, and suddenly her sense of balance was no longer entirely her own. She began to look forward to ordinary moments, meetings that meant nothing, brief exchanges in hallways, emails written in neutral language that she reread too many times. Nothing inappropriate ever happened. That was the most confusing part. John never flirted, never crossed boundaries, never hinted at anything beyond respect, and yet Mary felt closer to him than she had ever felt to anyone. She started noticing the absence as much as the presence. On days when John worked remotely, the office felt hollow. When meetings were led by someone else, she struggled to focus. Her attention drifted, always returning to the same quiet thought. Why does this matter so much? Mary told herself she was projecting, that she was simply lonely, that this was temporary, but temporary feelings don't reshape daily life. She began adjusting her schedule to increase the chance of seeing him. Arriving earlier, staying later, she paid attention to his habits, the coffee he preferred, the hours he was most focused, the moments when his guard seemed slightly lowered. None of it was intentional at first. It was instinct. And instinct, when left unchecked, becomes strategy. Mary's internal world slowly reorganized itself around John. Her confidence at work depended on his reactions. Her sense of worth rose and fell with his approval. His attention became the quiet measure by which she evaluated herself. She didn't want him physically. Not yet. What she wanted was something deeper and far more dangerous. She wanted to matter uniquely, to be irreplaceable, to be the one person who understood him without demanding anything. That desire grew heavier each time she reminded herself he was married. Because marriage made him unreachable, and unreachable things carry weight. Mary began to imagine alternate versions of reality, a life where timing was different, where boundaries didn't exist, where John noticed what she felt without her having to say it. These fantasies didn't feel dramatic. They felt reasonable. After all, she wasn't asking for much, just to be chosen. John, however, began to sense the shift, not through words, but through energy. He noticed the way Mary lingered after meetings, the way her eyes searched his face before looking away, the emotional intensity behind her quiet demeanor. John had lived long enough to recognize unspoken attachment, and that recognition made him uncomfortable. Because he had built his life around control, and control requires distance, so he did what came naturally to him. He stepped back. He shortened conversations, kept interactions strictly professional, removed the warmth Mary had begun to depend on. To John, it was a responsible decision. To Mary, it felt like abandonment. And that was the moment admiration stopped being safe. Because once someone becomes essential to your emotional balance, distance doesn't feel neutral. It feels threatening. And Mary was no longer afraid of being alone. She was afraid of losing him. John did not confront Mary immediately. At first, he tried to ignore what he was sensing. He told himself he was imagining things, that he was reading too much into subtle changes, that Mary was simply a dedicated employee whose intensity came from professionalism, not attachment. But John had spent decades learning to read people, and what he felt around Mary was no longer neutral. There was a weight to her attention, a quiet urgency behind her silence, an emotional expectation that had never been spoken but was unmistakably present. John understood something important before Mary did. Unspoken feelings are still feelings, and if left unaddressed, they grow. For John, boundaries were not just rules, they were survival tools. His marriage to Evelyn was stable but distant, built on routine rather than intimacy. And because of that, John had learned to protect order above all else. Emotional chaos made him uncomfortable. Uncertainty felt dangerous. Mary represented uncertainty, not because she did anything wrong, but because she felt too much without asking for permission. So John decided to act. He chose a moment that felt safe, a quiet afternoon, a conversation framed as professionalism. His tone was calm, measured, almost gentle. He told Mary he appreciated her work, that she was talented, reliable, important to the team, and then he placed the distance back where it belonged. He reminded her that he was married, that personal boundaries mattered, that nothing beyond work could ever exist between them. He did not accuse her. He did not shame her. He did not raise his voice, which made the moment devastating in a way Mary had never experienced before. Mary listened carefully. She nodded at the right moments. She even smiled. On the surface, she appeared composed. Inside, something fractured. Rejection, when loud, can be fought against. Rejection, when cruel, can be hated. But rejection delivered calmly, caused with kindness, leaves no target for anger. It leaves only loss. Mary walked back to her desk, feeling disconnected from her body. The office lights felt harsher, the sounds sharper. Everything that had once felt steady suddenly felt unstable. John had not said anything new. He had only confirmed what she already knew. But confirmation removes hope, and hope, even when painful, can be addictive. Mary realized in that moment that she had been surviving on possibility, on the idea that maybe someday something would change. John had taken that possibility away, and with it, the fragile emotional balance Mary had been holding together. She tried to rationalize. She told herself this was normal, that rejection was part of life, that she was an adult who should move on. But emotional truth does not respond to logic. The silence she had once accepted returned, heavier than before. Now it wasn't empty. It was occupied by absence. Mary began replaying every interaction in her mind, every pause, every look. Every moment she had believed meant something. She questioned herself relentlessly. Had she imagined everything? Had she embarrassed herself? Had she misread kindness as intimacy? The questions had no answers, and unanswered questions are where obsession grows. John, meanwhile, believed he had done the right thing. He felt relief. The boundary was re-established, order restored. But relief is often temporary, because emotional distance does not erase attachment, it only hides it. Mary did not grow angry with John. She grew afraid that she had returned to the version of herself that existed before him, afraid that being seen had only been temporary, afraid that silence was her natural state, and connection an illusion. That fear settled quietly inside her. And fear, when left alone long enough, looks for solutions, even dangerous ones. After the rejection, Mary's life did not collapse. That was the strange part. Nothing dramatic happened. She still woke up at the same time, still went to work, still smiled when spoken to. From the outside, everything looked unchanged. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. The silence that returned to her life was no longer familiar. Before John, silence had been neutral, empty but manageable. Now it was crowded with thoughts she could not quiet. Mary replayed the conversation endlessly. Not the words themselves, but the tone, the calm certainty in John's voice. The finality. He hadn't hesitated, hadn't struggled, hadn't looked conflicted. That detail mattered more than she wanted to admit, because it suggested something terrifying, that choosing her had never truly been an option. At first, Mary blamed herself. She questioned her judgment. her perception, her emotional restraint. She wondered if she had imagined everything, if she had mistaken professionalism for intimacy, if she had created meaning where none existed. That self-doubt consumed her for weeks, but self-blame has a limit. Eventually, the mind looks for relief, and relief often comes in the form of reinterpreting reality. Mary began to think about Evelyn, not as a person, but as an idea. She pictured a woman distant, unavailable, emotionally cold, a wife who fulfilled obligations but offered no warmth, a marriage built on habit, not love. Mary had no proof of this. But she didn't need proof. She needed permission, and so without realizing it, she rewrote the story. John wasn't choosing distance because he didn't feel anything. He was choosing it because he was trapped. Trapped by routine, by responsibility, by a marriage that had already ended emotionally. This version of reality was easier to live with. In it, Mary was not rejected. She was waiting for timing to change, for courage to surface, for circumstances to shift. She told herself she wasn't interfering. She wasn't crossing boundaries. She was simply seeing the truth before others did. That belief softened the fear. It transformed pain into purpose. Mary became hyper-aware of John's behavior, searching for confirmation. Every quiet moment became evidence. Every neutral interaction reinforced her theory. If he looked tired, it was because he was unhappy. If he seemed distant, it was because he was restrained. If he avoided emotional closeness, it was because he had been denied it for too long. Mary no longer asked whether she was right. She asked whether she was patient enough. And patience, when mixed with obsession, becomes endurance. Her thoughts began to drift away from logic and toward possibility. What if things could be different? What if free will wasn't as fixed as people believed? What if desire only needed the right nudge? These questions did not feel dangerous. They felt practical. Mary did not think of herself as someone who would cross moral lines. She still believed in being a good person. But goodness, she learned, is flexible when wrapped in intention. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She wasn't trying to destroy a marriage. She was trying to correct something unfair, and that distinction mattered to her. The more she repeated it, the less resistance she felt. Fear had changed shape. It was no longer fear of being alone. It was fear of accepting that this empty, quiet life was all there would ever be. And fear like that does not stay passive. It searches, it reaches, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, it begins to look for answers, outside the boundaries of reason. Mary told herself she was done thinking about John. She repeated it like a promise, like a rule, like something that could be enforced through discipline. But discipline only works when the mind is calm. And Mary's mind was anything but calm. Sleep became fragmented. She would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the city, counting the seconds between thoughts that never stopped arriving. During the day, she functioned. At night, she unraveled. Her thoughts circled the same questions over and over again. What if she was wrong? What if she wasn't? What if something had been interrupted before it could begin? Mary tried distraction first. Television played in the background without meaning. Music felt too intrusive. Books demanded attention she could no longer give. Silence, once neutral, now felt aggressive. And so one night, without fully deciding to, Mary opened her laptop. Not with intention, not with a plan, just with restlessness. She typed words that felt harmless enough. Emotional connection, unbreakable bond. When two people are meant to be together. She didn't search for spells. She didn't search for magic. Not yet. What she found instead were stories. Anonymous posts, fragments of confessions, people describing feelings that refused to fade, attachments that seemed immune to time and distance. Some spoke about energy, others about influence, about intention. Mary told herself this was psychology, metaphor, symbolism, nothing dangerous. She kept reading. The more she read, the more a quiet idea began to form. What if feelings weren't as free as people claimed? What if desire followed rules no one talked about? What if connection could be guided? That thought didn't feel immoral. It felt practical. Mary was careful with her language, even in her own mind. She didn't think about control. She thought about alignment. She didn't think about force. She thought about removing obstacles. After all, she wasn't trying to create something out of nothing. She was trying to restore something that already existed. That distinction mattered to her. She began searching more deliberately. Late-night forums hidden behind usernames and disclaimers. Conversations filled with warnings disguised as advice. And that's when she noticed a pattern. Certain names appeared repeatedly, always followed by caution, always surrounded by stories that ended quietly. One name stood out. Blackwood. There was no website, no advertisement, just mentions. Not for the curious, not for the impatient, not for those who expect happy endings. Mary stared at the name longer than she meant to. Something about it felt final. She closed the laptop, told herself this was enough, that she had gone too far. But the name lingered. The following nights it returned uninvited, in moments of exhaustion, in moments of hope. Mary imagined possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine before. What if timing wasn't absolute? What if choice could be influenced without being stolen? What if free will was more flexible than people believed? These thoughts did not feel dark. They felt like solutions. Mary still believed she was a good person. She wasn't looking to hurt anyone. She wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't trying to destroy a marriage. She was trying to escape silence. And silence, she had learned, was capable of destroying people slowly. The more she justified the thought, the easier it became. Fear no longer paralyzed her. It motivated her. Mary returned to the forums, searched the name again. This time she didn't close the page. She read the warnings carefully. This does not create love. This does not guarantee happiness. This comes with limits. Limits felt acceptable. Anything felt acceptable compared to doing nothing. Mary didn't know yet what she would do. She hadn't decided to cross the line, but she had stepped close enough to see it clearly. And once you see a line clearly, pretending it doesn't exist becomes impossible. That night, Mary didn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the city breathe outside her window, knowing that something inside her had already begun to move. Reason hadn't disappeared. It had simply been outvoted. Mary did not contact Blackwood immediately. She waited, not because she was unsure, but because part of her still hoped hesitation might save her from what she already knew she was going to do. For days, she carried the name with her like a weight. At work, at home, in silence. Eventually, the waiting became unbearable. The message she sent was short, carefully written, almost formal. She expected questions, explanations, judgment. Instead, she received an address. No greeting, no reassurance. Just a location and a time. Blackwood lived far from the city center, in a neighborhood that felt forgotten. The kind of place where streetlights flickered and houses leaned inward, as if keeping secrets. When Mary knocked on the door, She almost turned away, but the door opened before she could decide. Blackwood was older than she expected, not mysterious, not imposing, just tired. His eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes from witnessing too many desperate choices. He did not invite her to sit. He asked her one question. "Do you understand what you are asking for?" Mary answered without hesitation, "Yes." That was a lie. Blackwood listened as she spoke. About timing, about distance, about how things could have been different. He did not interrupt. When she finished, the room felt heavier. "This will not create love," he said calmly. "It will create attachment." Mary nodded. He continued, "It will bind him to you emotionally. Not happily, not freely." She swallowed. "And it will last exactly 7 years." Mary froze. 7 years, he repeated. No more, no less. She asked the question she had been avoiding. "What happens after?" Blackwood looked at her for a long moment. "When it ends," he said, "he will leave. Not because he is angry, not because you fail, but because the influence will be gone." Mary felt fear, real fear, rise in her chest. This was not forever. This was borrowed time. She could still stop. Blackwood gave her the chance. "Once we begin," he said, "there is no undoing. Only waiting." Mary thought of silence, of nights staring at the ceiling, of returning to a life untouched. 7 years felt like certainty compared to nothing. She agreed. The ritual room was small and bare. On the table rested a handmade doll shaped like a man, neutral, faceless. Blackwood asked for personal items. Hair, a name written by her own hand, a photograph. Mary's hands trembled as she placed them on the table. The thread was red, thin but strong. Blackwood wrapped it around the doll's chest slowly, deliberately, each loop tightening the intention. He spoke no dramatic words. No chants. Only names. Mary felt something shift. Not warmth. Not joy. Pressure. When it was done, Blackwood stepped back. "It is finished," he said. Mary looked at the doll, then at her hands. Nothing looked different, and yet everything was. As she left the house, the city felt unfamiliar, sharper, quieter. Mary understood something then. She had not created love. She had postponed loss. 7 years. That was the price. The change did not happen all at once. There was no dramatic moment where John suddenly chose Mary and abandoned his life. It happened quietly. Within weeks of the ritual, John began pulling away from Evelyn. Not angrily, not cruelly, just emotionally. He grew distant, withdrawn, as if something inside him had shifted direction. Mary noticed before anyone else did. He started calling her more often, looking for reasons to see her, finding comfort in her presence in ways he never had before. When the relationship finally began, it felt unreal. Not passionate, not overwhelming, but certain. John stayed. He chose her. Mary told herself this was love. For the first time in her life, she felt selected, prioritized, necessary. The silence that had once followed her disappeared. But it was replaced by something heavier. John became dependent. He needed constant reassurance, constant closeness. He struggled when Mary wasn't nearby. At first, she interpreted this as attachment, then as devotion, and only later, as imprisonment. John stopped seeing friends, stopped pursuing interests, stopped existing outside the relationship. He wasn't unhappy, but he wasn't alive either. Mary felt it in small moments, in the way his eyes dulled, in the way his laughter disappeared, in the way his presence felt heavy instead of warm. Years passed, not distinctly, not memorably. They blended together into routine. The relationship became predictable, scheduled, emotionally stagnant. Mary had what she wanted, but it didn't feel like victory. She began to understand something Blackwood had warned her about. This was not love. It was maintenance. 7 years of maintaining something that could not grow. John's dependence turned into resentment, his closeness into suffocation. And Mary, trapped by her own choice, stayed, because leaving would mean admitting the truth, that she hadn't been chosen freely. She had been bound. By the 5th year, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Arguments became frequent. Silence returned, not the old silence, but a hostile one. Mary felt exhausted. John felt lost. Neither knew why, but the bond held because it was not theirs to break. As the 7th year approached, something subtle changed. John began pulling away again, not intentionally, instinctively, as if something inside him was waking up. Mary felt it, and for the first time since the ritual, she was afraid again, not of being alone, but of what would happen when the borrowed time ran out. The end did not announce itself. There was no sudden argument, no explosion, no dramatic revelation. The end arrived quietly, the same way the spell had once begun. Mary noticed the change before John did. It started in small, unsettling ways. John no longer reached for her automatically, no longer needed reassurance, no longer looked to her as an anchor. His presence felt lighter, more distant, more himself. At first, Mary told herself this was normal, that relationships evolved, that dependence fading was healthy, but deep down she knew something was loosening. John began sleeping restlessly, spending more time alone, thinking, truly thinking, but for the first time in years. And then one morning clarity arrived. Not confusion, not anger. Clarity. John woke up feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Choice. He moved through the apartment slowly, observing details he had stopped noticing. The walls, the silence, the weight of years that suddenly felt huge. He looked at Mary and felt no hatred, no resentment, only understanding. He understood that he had stayed not because he wanted to, but because something had held him there. And now that something was gone, John didn't confront Mary with accusations. He didn't demand explanations. He simply told the truth. This was never love, he said quietly. It was attachment. Mary listened without interrupting, because she had known this moment would come. 7 years ago, someone had warned her. She remembered the words clearly now. When it ends, he will leave on his own. John packed his things calmly, deliberately. There was no cruelty in his movements, no urgency, only finality. Mary stood still, watching the life she had fought so hard to hold together dissolve without resistance. She did not beg. She did not cry. She finally understood something she had refused to accept for years. Love that is forced does not grow. It only lasts until freedom returns. When John closed the door behind him, the apartment fell silent. Not the old silence, not the empty one. This silence carried truth. Mary sat alone, the weight of the years settling into her chest. She thought of everything she had gained, and everything she had lost. 7 years of presence, 7 years of borrowed time, 7 years that never became love. Only proof. Proof that no ritual can replace choice. No spell can create desire. No control can transform attachment into affection. Mary did not curse herself. She did not justify herself. She simply learned. Some lessons arrive late, but they still matter. As dawn light entered the apartment, Mary understood the final truth of her story. Love is not something you bind. It is something you earn. And when it is real, it stays, without threads, without fear, without magic.